Is Eli Ratner. I'm the Vice President and Director of Studies at CNAS. And what we're going to do today is to use the time between now and the lunchtime breakout sessions to tell you a little bit about some of the new and innovative China work currently underway at the center. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Liz and Dan, to go deeper on a few specific lines of effort. But before doing so, allow me to set the stage. Because while we all believe, and I imagine many of you in the audience believe, that the United States has everything it needs to succeed in this competition, it's also the case that as we gather here today in this hall, America is falling behind as China seeks to undermine U.S. power and influence, diminish the role of the United States in Asia, and establish its own sphere of influence. Now, it's worth stopping here and asking, so what? Right? So what if China comes to dominate Asia? And still today in the debate, we hear important and influential voices saying, don't worry about it. China's aims are limited, or even if they're not limited, they'll ultimately want what we want, that things won't change all that much. Well, honestly and respectfully, the three of us disagree. And again, I imagine many people in this audience would disagree as well. What we're concerned about is that if the United States does not rise to this most important occasion, the future has great potential to see a China-led order that will be less free and less democratic, less open to U.S. trade and investment, more hostile to U.S. security partnerships, and ultimately governed by raw Chinese power rather than mutually agreed upon rules. Now, of course, it wasn't supposed to be this way, was it? U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War was predicated on the belief that China would gradually liberalize inside and out, freeing its society, opening its economy, and coming to accept and support the prevailing international order. What we find today instead is what CNAS Chairman Kurt Campbell and I have called a China reckoning, where Washington can no longer deny the fact that Beijing is doubling down on its authoritarian model, only increasing the role of the party in the economy, and using its newfound power and wealth to refashion international politics in ways that are increasingly illiberal and at odds with U.S. interests. So what are we going to do about it? And this is the first point I want to leave you with today. Rising to the China challenge is ultimately about ourselves. It's about American competitiveness. We need to spend less time trying to change China and put more focus on developing domestic and foreign policies that enhance American competitiveness and the competitiveness of our alliances and our partnerships for the 21st century. Which gets me directly to my second point, and this will be a point that both Liz and Dan will reinforce in their presentations as well. That as we think about the China challenge as a nation, we, the United States, need to renew our own confidence. That as we answer the challenge of a new American competitiveness, we need to proceed with the conviction and the confidence that the foundations of American power are strong. And I'm going to say that again, because every time you think about the China challenge, this is where I want you to start. The foundations of American power are strong. Our people, our demographics, our geography, our dynamic private sector, innovative society, leading universities, powerful alliances and partnerships give us everything we need to succeed in this competition if we're only willing to get in the game. So how do we do that? How do we go about devising more competitive strategies for the 21st century? Now, we heard in the earlier session, in fact, throughout much of the morning, about the military challenge, which painted a troubling picture of a narrowing strategic advantage for the United States. And as harrowing as that prospect is, it is hardly the entire story. Because what makes the China challenge so serious, so daunting, and so ultimately consequential is that it stretches across nearly every facet of international politics, military and security, but also diplomacy and ideology and information and technology, and of course, economics. And it is in this final domain of the economic competition where the demand for new research and new concepts and new strategies and new ideas is arguably most urgent. It's where Beijing is barreling forward with its own power plays at a time when Washington looks flat-footed and disorganized. Unlike the military competition, which admittedly will be difficult, remains familiar territory for Beltway strategists. However, the commercial and economic competition remains poorly understood and not particularly well integrated into our overall national security strategy. I saw this firsthand in my time at the White House in the final years of the Obama administration, where our approach to China was very often divided between trade and economics on the one hand and defense and security on the other. These different policy domains, they had different processes that were led by different people with different vocabularies using different toolkits, ultimately resulting in strategies that were often not only divorced from one another, but actually working at cross purposes. And it was crystal clear at the time, and it's even clearer today, that for the United States to succeed in this competition, these worlds will have to be brought together. And this is precisely what we're doing at CNAS, working at the nexus of economics and security across several lines of effort. As Liz will describe in a few moments, we're devising novel strategies for the United States to counter China's economic coercion. And as Dan will address afterward, we're looking at new ways for how the United States can deal with the geopolitical implications of China's Belt and Road strategy. We're looking at how Washington can work with friendly capitals to build up an alliance innovation base and coordinate more closely on trade and investment measures. And we're looking at how radical revolutionary transformations in financial technologies, including cryptocurrencies and virtual currencies, are reshaping the landscape of international politics and changing the toolkit of international statecraft. Now, to show you what this looks like in practice, please allow me to introduce my colleague, Liz Rosenberg. She runs the Energy, Economics, and Security program at CNAS. Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Eli. I'm going to talk now about how China is using unprecedented economic coercion to advance its national interests. China has used economic policies as a long-standing facet of its domestic political management and of its international engagement strategy. But over the last decade, China has used specific and targeted economic measures to punish foreign capitals and to forcibly advance its own foreign policy goals. We can see instances of that in discrete cases where China has directed that economic punishment on foreign capitals and companies for policies that offend its view of sovereignty and its territorial claims. So I'll give you a few examples that have affected our treaty allies. On Japan first, China cut rare earth minerals exports to Japan following a clash over the disputed Senkaku Islands. And on the Philippines, China let Philippine bananas rot in port after tensions flared with Manila over a disputed South China Sea reef. And on South Korea, following South Korea's deployment of a missile defense system, China slashed tourism going to South Korea, and it also throttled back on imports from South Korea of specific consumer goods, including cosmetics and music. And in addition to these cases, China has brought to their knees specific foreign companies from these various countries that operate in China. So the tactics that China uses to exert this economic coercion look like China claiming to uphold health, safety, environmental standards, and to protect its tourists traveling abroad, also stoking boycotts nationally. There's no declaratory policy, there is no specific legal or administrative regime that China uses to deploy this coercion. And that informality gives China a lot of flexibility and deniability. It's also made it really difficult for foreign countries to push back on that with a formal trade complaint at the WTO, for example. Now, I've been working with colleagues at CNAS to understand what these various cases mean about China's evolving economic statecraft, and also the expanding set of core interests that are the triggers for China to reach to this tool of statecraft, this economic coercion. It's clear to us that China is learning across various cases, and it is getting better and better all the time at focusing that economic harm on the foreign targets, those countries and companies, and limiting harm to its own domestic constituencies, its citizens and its companies. It's been difficult for US policymakers and foreign counterparts to always understand and recognize this coercion as it's taking place. And in our engagements with international counterparts, policymakers, and researchers in the private sector that are observing this phenomenon, we've observed a very powerful sense of defeatism, particularly in East Asia, where there's a narrative of perceived inevitability about China's success in bending to its will those policies from foreign countries such that it can succeed ultimately. It's true that in the United States there's frustration, but not the same kind of sense of inevitability about China's success. And one of the reasons why there's a more limited understanding in the United States of this phenomenon is because it's been only relatively more recently that US firms have been targeted. Some of you, our guests here today, may actually work for some of the US companies that have recently been targeted. Airlines, for example, or automobile manufacturers, you may be, and your colleagues may be thinking about how you respond. We at CNAS are thinking a lot about the appropriate policy measures to respond to this Chinese economic coercion, and it's abundantly clear to myself, my colleagues, other of us who are working on this issue that the United States needs a broad array of tools to forcefully push back and in an internationally coordinated manner. It's just not going to work for the United States to take a unilateral approach that features a one-off response to specific incidents. We will be doomed to failure if that is the case. China has proven itself exceptionally capable of winning concessions and leverage when it picks off specific targets with ad hoc measures. It's going to be inadequate for us just to adopt narrow economic policies or narrow technology policies. And furthermore, we can't just double down on a trade war with China. It may be appealing to think about these strong escalatory measures to push back on China, but that still leaves China in a position and with too many opportunities to harass US companies and to beat up on our allies. So if you've listened to what I've been saying and thought to yourself, this sounds like a difficult, formidable challenge, you're not wrong. This is hard. And China holds many cards in its hand by virtue of having cultivated economic relationships with many countries internationally over many decades. Right now, 130 countries call China their most vital trading partner. And the United States and China are important trading partners to one another. But the future is not inevitably China's here, as my colleague Eli was saying before, and it's not clear that China is necessarily going to win. That is not what needs to happen or what necessarily will happen. The United States has many advantages that we can build on, sources of strength. Eli had talked about some of them in his remarks earlier, and let me list a few more in the financial domain in particular. So we have deep and liquid capital markets. We have attractive currency markets, which are an excellent place to store value for everyone in the world. We have a dependable regulatory regime. We have good access to capital. We have outstanding technology innovation. And together, these assets provide US influence and a strong basis to develop tools to respond to this challenge. So what does that look like in practice? What are the policies that the United States administration and our Congress should put in place? I will offer you 5 of them that we've been talking about and recommended recently. The first one is for the US administration. Centralize and coordinate. Across the US administration, there are an array of different offices and agencies that think about this Chinese economic coercion challenge. We know that there are economists stovepiped on one hand. Eli was mentioning this earlier. There's also defense and security people who are thinking about this in other arenas. But if they can be coordinated more closely, they will be better able to understand and respond, and importantly, to work with foreign counterparts who are targeted by this economic coercion. A second recommendation. diversify trading relationships. This is for the administration a recommendation to work closely with allies abroad who trade significantly with China to make sure that they're not in a position where China is their only customer or that it controls key nodes in their supply chains. That will make them more resilient, and it'll be a form of an insurance policy in the face of this economic coercion. Third, and this is also for the administration, more information and more disclosure. So the US government must collect, analyze, and publicly disclose more information about what China is doing to beat up on foreign companies and what it means to do business with China today. Having that information out there in public, and that is the most important part of this recommendation, it'll be a kind of deterrent of itself to China. And of course, it will make it easier for US interests and policymakers to work with international counterparts to address this challenge. Fourth, financial compensation. This is a recommendation for the US Congress, which should allocate funds to a US Treasury Department administered facility that can compensate targets of financial coercion. Providing that kind of economic support will stiffen the resolve of companies that are targeted by this coercion. It will build trust in the United States, and that will make China think twice about exerting this coercion in the first instance. And fifth, anti-boycott statutes. Also for Congress, which should consider reviving a set of laws regarding anti-boycott laws such that it can help to push back in a way that will counter and directly respond to China's stoking of nationalist fervor to incite these boycotts and protests that target foreign countries. It'll give US companies a legal basis to resist being pulled into these campaigns that China is pushing forward that target third countries, which are also often our allies. For example, Taiwan and South Korea. So these ideas should give you a sense that the United States has good options. It has options that must be undertaken urgently, and many right here at home. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dan Kleiman, who will talk to you about some other options that the United States has to respond to some other forms of Chinese economic statecraft. Dan is a senior fellow in our Asia Pacific Security Program. Over to you.
Thanks, Liz. If economic coercion is one of China's power plays, then its Belt and Road Initiative is another. The Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes called One Belt, One Road, is China's grand vision for an interconnected world, brought together by a web of largely Chinese-funded physical and digital infrastructure. Some observers have called the Belt and Road China's Marshall Plan. This is the wrong way to think about it. To start, look at the geography. The Marshall Plan focused on Western Europe. The Belt and Road, by contrast, seeks to link together Asia, the Indian Ocean region, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The resources involved are also quite different. In 2017 dollars, the Marshall Plan cost the United States roughly $122 billion. The Belt and Road, looking at the period from 2014 to 2017 at both investment and construction, has involved $340 billion. And that number, of course, continues to grow. Last, but most important, the objectives of the Belt and Road and the Marshall Plan differ fundamentally. The Marshall Plan was ultimately about empowerment, about restoring war-torn economies and strengthening fragile democracies. The Belt and Road, simply put, is a Chinese vehicle to advance its interests, create leverage, and ultimately it's harmful to good governance as well as human rights. Let's go deeper now and look at how exactly is the Belt and Road reshaping the world to China's advantage. For one, the Belt and Road is paving the way for a more global Chinese military. Djibouti is a prime example where China first established a civilian port and then followed up with a nearby military facility, its first base ever overseas. The Belt and Road is also creating debt dependency on China. A leading example of this is Sri Lanka, which ran up so much debt that it had to engage Beijing in a debt for equity swap, giving China a 99-year lease, yes, 99 years, over a strategically located port. Then there is good governance. The Belt and Road is eroding good governance as Beijing seeks to win local support for various projects. This is a challenge not only in the Indo-Pacific, but even in Europe. For example, in 2017, the European Commission opened an investigation looking into Hungary's awarding of a contract to a Chinese firm. Further, the Belt and Road is serving to export elements of Chinese surveillance model. This is happening now, as we speak, in Africa. Huawei, which is a leading Chinese information technology company, very proudly advertises that in Kenya, it is building what it calls safe cities that feature networks of surveillance cameras tied in to a public security cloud. Much like the challenge of China's economic coercion that Liz discussed, the Belt and Road poses the United States and its allies and partners with a unique challenge, one that demands a new set of tools. Now is the time to think creatively and be ambitious, and at CNAS we are coming up with recommendations for how the US can address the Belt and Road. Our first key recommendation is this, that the United States must offer a positive vision that can serve as an alternative to not only the Belt and Road, but also China's economic model more broadly. This starts with advancing a development path for countries that is free, open, and sustainable, that is predicated on attributes such as debt sustainability, innovation, entrepreneurship, and building local capacity. The United States should also advocate for regional connectivity solutions, drawing an implicit contrast with the Belt and Road, which is very much China's top-down vision of an interconnected world. And yes, the United States should do more on trade, either rejoin the TPP or pursue a similarly ambitious, high-quality trade and investment agreement. Our second key recommendation is that the United States must debunk the narrative that China is promoting, namely, Beijing is inevitably ascendant and America will simply go on in decline. Today, the United States lacks a coherent counter-narrative and the toolkit to promote it. The United States might start, for example, by creating a 21st century institution or institutions that would fulfill the role of the US Information Agency, which was disbanded after the Cold War at a time when many thought strategic competition was simply a thing of the past. Third, the United States should double down on its support for good governance abroad. Indeed, transparency, a free press, civil society, rule of law, all of these serve to inoculate countries against the type of corrupt backroom deals that leave China with enduring leverage and governments with a lasting financial hangover. When it comes to Belt and Road and the China challenge more generally, American values and interests very much go hand in hand. Fourth, the United States must seize opportunities to cooperate with allies and partners in addressing the Belt and Road. Indeed, in the larger competition with China, American allies and partners represent a singular advantage. Looking at Belt and Road, for example, the United States might work with its allies and partners to shape, and where necessary constrain, China's pursuit of military access abroad. In concert with allies and partners, the United States can also marshal the resources needed to effectively compete with Belt and Road, particularly in areas where the US has a comparative advantage, such as information technology. Imagine, for example, a digital development fund under the auspices of the OECD that would support information connectivity projects in developing countries as a sort of a counterpoint to China's own exportation of its surveillance model. To close, looking at the scope and scale of China's power plays, it is easy to succumb to Beijing's narrative. But as you've heard from Eli, Liz, and now me, that would be very much a mistake. The United States has a decisive vote in shaping the 21st century, and now is the moment for a new American competitiveness. Whether you currently serve in government or whether you're working outside, whether you are a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, whether you are in private industry or academia, We invite you, as members of the CNAS community, to join us in an effort to address the China challenge. The United States can prevail in this competition, and at CNAS, we are laying the foundation to do just that. Thank you for your time. Thank you again. I now have to read this card out, and it's probably more complex than our presentation, so please listen. It deals with your lunch logistics. We are transitioning to our lunch break in our breakout sessions now. You all should have a name tag when you arrive today. It includes the breakout session you're registered for, and the color of your name tag corresponds with the room you will be in. When you leave this room, there will be signs that correspond to those colors, so please just follow the signs. If you are not registered for a breakout session, we invite you to join us for lunch in the foyer area where you entered this morning. And if you have any questions, CNAS staff are standing by to help. We will reconvene here at 1:30 p.m. sharp. Thank you again.